Roger Vernon thought there was nothing quite like the sound of footsteps on an empty street when the fog was thick. The Baltimore cobblestone made a pleasing echo when there were no people around, and at this hour there rarely were. At that moment, however, he wasn't thinking about the sounds his footsteps made as they faded away into the hazy darkness. He was thinking of the wounds between his ribs that wouldn't stop bleeding. He was wondering if any of his organs had been pierced, if they were leaking fluids inside his body. His face was bloody and swollen, and he wondered casually how many teeth he had lost. Most of his thoughts, however, were about his family, always thinking of them. If Roger had to describe himself in the simplest of terms, it would be family man, and he would have smiled when he said it. That was before. Baltimore was a lively port town, but in this part of Fells Point the houses were dark and still. During the day, ships still came and men still unloaded endless crates of goods, but not in the volume they used to. The nation was still in the first half of the Great Depression, and its greedy tendrils were choking out life wherever they could find it. Baltimore was no exception. Like so many parts of so many cities, there were plenty of vacancies to be found. He moved from building to building, never trying any of the knobs, just searching the front of each house and then hobbling along to the next one, leaving behind the occasional red splatter on the street. In the distance he heard the rich, haunting bells familiar to all who lived this close to the shipyards. He checked another door, decided it was not the one he wanted, and moved on again. He shuffled down the street with his hands pressed to his side, imagining he was holding his guts in, which wasn't that far from the truth. Something caught his eye. Among the row of dark, disheveled houses, a lone second-story window flickered dimly with what could only be candlelight. He moved in its direction, stopping once again when he saw what hung next to the door. There it was, the thing he had half expected not to exist at all. The thing he had scoffed at before that night and had so recently become his most desperate hope. Maybe his only hope, if that steady flow of blood from his side was any valid indicator. It was getting harder and harder to walk straight, and his vision blurred out twice, but he wasn't dead yet. He moved quickly towards the door, so hunched over with pain it was a miracle he didn't topple over face first. He made it to the door, and his hand found its way to the handle. He tried it and found the door to be open. He knew it would be. For a moment he had to grab the door frame and rest, but Roger knew he was a man who could not afford to rest for long. For him, time was a dwindling commodity, so he made his way inside, closing the door behind him and leaving behind his smeared, bloody handprint on its frame. Next to the handprint hung the thing whose dark promise had brought Roger here in his final mortal desperation. The thing he had half believed not to exist. Next to the door, from a frail piece of twine, hung a black rose. The stories that had led Roger to the house had told him about the rose and what it symbolized, which was why he wasn't surprised to find the front door had been unlocked. Inside was empty and cold, but he could see candlelight spilling from underneath the door upstairs. Holding his side and grimacing against the pain, he climbed the stairs and tried the door he already knew would be unlocked. He pushed his way inside, and the first thing he noticed was how bright the candlelight actually was. It looked so dim from outside, but inside the room burned with a warm red glow. It was an effect created by the candlelight on the walls, which were heavy with a thick red velvet. At one end of the room was a bar made of dark wood, and at the other were several small tables. There were people in there, as Roger had expected there to be, but finding them here brought him a shock all the same. They stared at him. The one on the left was a woman reading a book and drinking a tall glass of wine. She was beautiful in a way that he had thought only existed in paintings or poems if they used the right combination of words. Somehow she really was that beautiful. Her skin was as dark as the night sky, and she had the eyes of a predatory cat, wide and alert but not the least bit afraid. She wore bright gold jewelry and a flowing gown of bright blues and greens like something he had never seen before. Her lips were as red as the velvet walls. At the table next to her was a man in his 50s or 60s, though Roger guessed maybe he looked younger than he actually was. In front of him was a half-finished meal on fine white china. He had stopped his fork and knife mid-cut into his steak, staring at Roger with mild amusement. His lips were wide and thin, his eyes black like his hair, which was mixed with strands of the occasional gray. He was dressed impeccably, and Roger couldn't help but wonder what people dressed this well were doing in this part of town, squatting in the upstairs room like vagrants. Then he saw the kid in the corner, and his mind suddenly flooded with all variety of new questions. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, long hair matted and filthy, and dressed in the shredded remains of what might have once been a pillowcase. It was almost impossible to tell, but he thought the child was a girl. However, he thought that may have also been because the child was holding a girl's doll. Any distinguishing features in his or her face were contorted into the grimace of a wild animal, snarling and baring its teeth at him. He took an immediate step back, afraid the feral thing would actually attack him, but it didn't. The child just stared, drool leaking from their bottom lip and eyes darting wildly from Roger to the well-dressed man and back again, never landing on any one thing for more than a couple seconds. Then the child made a few displeased grunting noises and began gnawing at the arm of her doll, which from the looks of the thing was a common practice. "What you doing here?" a voice said from behind him. Roger spun around, astounded that he had missed two other people who had been sitting at the bar just a few feet from him. He had been too transfixed on the unlikely three at the other end of the room. There were two men with drinks in front of them, dressed more like the types of men you expected to find squatting in an abandoned upstairs portside bar. Roger turned to them. He had come this far, after all. "I'm looking for a man called Silas," Roger said, eyes darting from the man on the left to the man on the right, who appeared to suffer from a fairly aggressive twitch. "No one here by that name," the one on the left said. But Roger wasn't going to give up that easy. He looked at the man on the right. "How about you? Do you know Silas?" Roger asked. The man winced and became visibly uncomfortable, looking nervously to his friend with frantic eyes, uttering a pathetic little whine that was almost too low to hear. "Mute," the one on the left said. "What?" "Means he don't talk." The mute, twitchy man seemed to calm down. With that misunderstanding cleared up, he took a messy swig from the drink in front of him. "I saw the black rose outside. I heard you ought to leave. Now," the one on the left said as he eyed Roger's bloody shirt with a severely suspicious look. "Your trouble." He looked about ready to stand up and throw Roger out himself. The mute man on the right suddenly developed a whole new demeanor. He made fists and puffed out his lower lip in an almost comical fashion, as if to say, "Yeah, Buster, what he said, so hit the bricks." This was Roger's last hope, and he hadn't come all this way to be turned out. That was when the man in the impeccable suit finally spoke. "It's all right, Francis. He can stay." Roger turned, which sent a jolt of pain from the wound in his side. Coming up the stairs had taken more out of him than he had thought possible. "Come, sit." Roger fought the pain as best he could as he crossed the room, but he refused to sit. He wanted to stand when he said what he had come to say. He couldn't help but lock eyes with the woman in the blue and green gown. She lowered her book as she watched Roger limp across the room. It was difficult, but Roger looked away, looking instead to the man with the meal in front of him. "Her name is Adair. Beautiful, no?" the man asked. "Are you Silas?" Roger asked in return, ignoring the question. "I am," the man answered. "Do we have business?" "I've heard stories," Roger answered. A high-pitched growl caught him off guard, his eyes darting to the feral child who was now moving on all fours behind Silas, his or her animal eyes fixed distrustfully on Roger, the intruder. "I heard you have specific sorts of powers," he continued warily. "Powers beyond that of normal man. And if that were so, then I would ask you to use them to help me get what I need." At this Silas smiled, looking down at how Roger's wound had stained his right side a deep red. "Revenge? Against the men who did this to you, I should guess?" Silas replied. Roger's expression hardened, eliminating all traces of the previous fear and pain. The only feeling on his face now was hate. "Not for what they did to me." The wound on his side shrieked with pain, and Roger's mind couldn't help but return to what he was already thinking of as his last supper. They were never a family of means, even before the economy tanked. Their kitchen was nothing fancy, but Roger was always surprised and delighted at what Maggie could do with the few spices they did have and a pot of boiled potatoes. It was one of her talents, of which there were many. She was smart as a tack in the kitchen and out of it. She read more books than anyone he knew, when they could afford them, knew all about history, and could pretty much problem-solve her way around anything. Her brain had a way of just seeing around corners in a way he couldn't hope to understand. She could have worked in Congress or ran one of those big companies in the city, but he reckoned those just weren't the sorts of jobs women were allowed to do. Their loss had been his gain, and Roger had married Maggie the first chance he got. Truth be told, he had always found it a bit curious that she had settled on a dullard such as himself. Not that he wasn't handy around the house, and he certainly wasn't complaining, but Maggie was the backbone of the household, and they both knew it. Even so, she never treated him as anything less than equal, and he loved her for that. All he could hope to do was love her as best he could in return. It was all he had to give. His eyes moved from the steaming pot of potatoes to the crib in the corner where baby Rupert was still sleeping. Maggie moved swiftly, but careful not to make a noise in the kitchen and wake him. He hoped Rupert had inherited his mother's brains, but it was too early to tell. He was sure he had some good traits he hoped made it along too, but what he really hoped the kid had was a heapin' helpin' of Mom. If not, that would be okay too, and there would never be any shortage of love to go around. When Roger told people he was a family man, he did it with a wide smile. If he was a dullard, he was a happy one. Maggie laid down 2 modest bowls of steaming potatoes onto the table when the door practically exploded off its hinges. The names of the 2 men who barged inside were Charlie and George, a fact Roger overheard while everything was happening and would remember fiercely after it was over. The men ran inside, both screaming for everyone to stay where they were. They had clearly rehearsed this, and before Roger could get out of his chair, the man on the right, he would later learn to be George, bolted towards Maggie, grabbing her arms behind her back and putting a knife to her throat, while the other man, whose name was Charlie, came straight for Roger. Just as he was getting fully to his feet, the man was there, and before Roger could call out, Charlie had pulled a knife and rammed it up to the hilt into his side, sliding in perfectly between 2 of his ribs. He was standing face to face with him and could see he had a poorly healed scar across the bridge of his nose. Any fight Roger had in him was gone. He looked down stupidly at the knife as Charlie pulled it out. It dripped with hot, sticky blood. His blood. And then Charlie rammed it in again. Once again, the knife found the perfect space between 2 ribs. The pain was exquisite, and Roger felt himself lose all strength in his legs. Charlie apparently felt it too, because he grabbed Roger by the hair, pulled him off the knife, and threw him to the ground. Roger felt some of his teeth break as he hit the floor. By now, baby Rupert was wide awake and crying. Screaming was more like it, but with babies there was always a bit of crying thrown in. George held the knife to Maggie's throat, whispering in her ear and trying to calm her. "Shh, come on now, just calm down and be good, and we'll be out of your hair in no time. Come on, little lady, just be good." Charlie knelt down and pressed Roger's face harder into the wooden floor, pulling a gun from his back pocket and pushing its barrel up against his temple. "Tell me where it is," Charlie demanded. "Where what is?" Roger replied, tasting blood in his mouth. "The fucking money, genius!" Roger looked dumbfounded at the man leaning over him, then moved his eyes to a ceramic jar on his shelf. Even though it hurt immensely, he motioned towards it with his hand. "There! All I have," Roger said. Charlie smiled and stood up to retrieve the jar. He didn't even bother dumping it out. He just smashed it on the table, spilling out a few measly dollars and coins that had been hiding inside. "The fuck is that?" George said from across the room. Charlie's smile fell away as he turned back to Roger. "You think I'm a goddamn fool? Don't fuck with me, Vernon. Where's the rest?" Charlie demanded. "That's all we have," Roger insisted. Charlie leaned down again and grabbed Roger by the hair. "Don't lie to me!" Even with George's knife against her throat, Maggie was there to back up her husband. "He's telling the truth, I swear!" she screamed. "Lying bitch!" George bellowed, taking his knife away from her throat and pushing her doubled over against the dining table. "I'll show you what happens to lying bitches!" He pulled up her dress with one hand, which he held down over her neck as his other hand used the knife to cut off her underwear. "Don't touch her!" Roger called out, finding his mouth partially filled with blood. What he said came out garbled, and before he could try it again, Charlie covered his mouth with his hand. "We heard about that rich uncle of yours, and we heard that you saw a pretty sum of that money after he croaked. News travels fast, so where the fuck is it?" Roger heard his wife cry out, and then the steady thud, thud, thud of her body slamming against the kitchen table. He could hear Maggie screaming as George took what he wanted. He couldn't bring himself to look, and he hated himself for that. For better or for worse, that's what they had said. He thought this was as bad as it could get, and now he couldn't even bring himself to look. All the while, baby Rupert's cries seemed to reach a fever pitch, and Roger thought his mind couldn't possibly take any more. In that regard, however, the intruders had one more lesson to teach. "Charlie, shut that goddamn kid up!" George panted. This brought Roger back to reality. His eyes went to Charlie, looking down at him and grinning. "Sure thing, George. Sure thing." He thumbed back the hammer of his gun. No, Roger pleaded. "You ready to tell me where the money is?" "We don't have any money!" Roger could only hope the man believed him, but he didn't. "Wrong answer," Charlie said, putting on a fake cartoonish sad face. Then he pointed the gun into the crib. "No! Please, no!" Roger screamed, but his voice was cut off by a deafening bang. As the sound faded, the room settled into an eerie quiet. The screaming of the child, now gone, and the screaming of the parents, yet to begin. They were still trying to comprehend what had happened. Roger screamed as hard as his body would allow, hacking up more blood as he did so. Maggie, however, let forth the most agonizing scream Roger had ever heard in his life. He felt that if he should live through this, there would never be another night when his dreams wouldn't be filled with the echoing sounds of that scream. About that, Roger was correct. George had finished, buckling his pants back up with one hand as Maggie flailed violently under the power of his other. "Shut the fuck up!" George cried angrily. He finished with his belt buckle and pulled the knife back out. He lifted Maggie back up and put the knife to her throat once again. "One last chance, man," Charlie said casually, as if he was telling Roger he was missing some great 2-for-1 deal. Roger looked up helplessly, pleading with his eyes. "I swear," he choked. Charlie shook his head, disappointed. George drew the knife across Maggie's throat, spilling her blood in thick waves over the dining table over what remained of their boiled potatoes. Roger didn't think he had any screams left in him, but it turns out he did. He screamed and cried into the floor as the two men, ignoring him now, began to tear through his things. They ripped open drawers and sifted through every paper they could find. Maggie's blood pooling at the base of the table, Roger could hear them talking to each other about where else to look, one telling the other to check here or check there. Roger didn't care anymore. He just hoped that they would kill him soon. He had almost drifted into some liminal state of consciousness when something got his attention. One of the men was speaking. He thought it was Charlie, and it sounded upset. He tried to stay awake and listen, but it was hard. "The fuck does this say right here? Right fucking here!" He heard the sound of a slap. "Fuck, Charlie, come on, don't do that. Fucking read me the name at the top of this page, then." Roger heard the crinkling of paper. "Roger Vernon." George's voice dropped as he said it. Some understanding was making his way into his underwhelming brain. "Jeez, Charlie, I could have sworn." Roger heard another slap. "That inheritance went to Robert Vernon, not Roger. Robert fucking Christ," Charlie said. "Well, how many R. Vernons could there possibly be?" George pleaded. "How the fuck should I know? Obviously at least 2. Jesus Christ, you fucked this up," Charlie said as he rained blows down onto his partner, who was holding his arms up in defense. I'm sorry. What do we do now?" George whined. Roger stopped hitting him and looked over the carnage they had created. He thought for a moment, but not a very long one. He was certainly smarter than George, but he was never much in the brains department. "Take what you can. Make sure he's dead," Charlie said as he stormed out in a rage. George collected a few items from the shelves that he liked, then gathered the measly dollars and coins that had fallen from the broken ceramic jar, then leaned down next to Roger's face. Even with all the blood in his mouth and nose, Roger thought he could still smell the man's breath, and it made him want to puke. "No hard feelings," George said, as if they had done nothing more than bump into each other walking down the street. Then he grabbed Roger's head and slammed it hard twice into the ground. Roger was quiet after this. George nudged him with his boot, was satisfied, and left. "Make sure he's dead," the one named Charlie with the scar on his nose had said. But George was no better at completing this job than he had been at finding Robert Vernon. Roger stood before Silas in the Red Room, his hands clenched into tight fists and warm tears streaming down his face. He hadn't been sure he was going to be able to tell the story all the way through, but he thought he did as well as he could have, given the circumstances. "They don't deserve to live," Roger said through his gritted teeth. Silas did something then that Roger never expected. He laughed. Not an uproarious laugh, but a short chuckle as if Roger had just shared the most amusing anecdote. He cut another piece from his steak and took a bite. Roger could see now that it was entirely rare. Silas set his silverware down again and looked from Roger to the lovely Adea at the next table. "Quite the story, you know?" he asked. Adea's steely eyes were fixed on Roger as an ice-cold grin crawled across her elegant face. "Quite," she said matter-of-factly. "How about you boys?" Silas called to Francis and the mute, twitchy man in the back, who only nodded and kept their eyes fixed down at their drinks. Silas returned his attention to Roger. "You have suffered greatly, but I have no pity." At this, Roger's eyes shot up, and he felt a sudden flash of hatred for the man who was so casually belittling the murder of his entire family. "I do, however, have understanding. I understand the hate you feel in your heart. I understand the need you feel for vengeance. The need to take everything from those who have taken everything from you." Roger's eyes were locked on Silas, the man whose supposed powers could promise justice in its most ancient of forms. "The need to tear them up." "Yes," Roger said. It was all he could say. After telling his story, he felt just about talked out. Any smile which remained on Silas's face faded away. "Who knows you have come here?" Silas asked. "Nobody. I had heard rumors about the Black Rose," Roger replied. "We have traveled longer than we can remember. We never stay in the same place long, using the rose as a symbol to others like us. A symbol of safe haven. Man thinks he understands power, believes even he craves it. But faced with real power, their only instinct is to snuff it out, to extinguish its glory. So we must always move on. Silas looks over the faces of those in the room. The impossibly beautiful Adea, her jewelry shining like galaxies against the black of her skin, who had once served in the house of the cruelest slave master in southern Georgia. Francis and his forever silent friend, usually unable to sit still for more than an instant at a time, but now unusually steady, his full attention on Silas. The child, savage and writhing, whose origins were a mystery even to them. We are a family, and there is power there too. Roger shifted uncomfortably, anxious for Silas to get to some kind of point on the matter at hand. Finally, he did just that. There is no cheap price for what you ask. I've lost everything, but I'll pay any cost. I'll find a way. You do not know the meaning of loss, Silas said, almost mockingly. I'll pay it, Roger said again. Silas stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he meant it or not. Finally, he made his decision. Very well, then, Silas said, leaning back in his chair. Roger did something he thought impossible, and smiled. It was a smile of relief, not of any real happiness, and for a long moment there was only silence until Roger's impatience got the best of him. So now what? He asked, and at that moment Adea took a final sip from her glass of wine and got to her feet. Roger turned to her and was surprised how tall she really was. Adea, please help our new friend, Silas said, with what seemed to be a hint of dramatic melancholia. Adea smiled at Roger. He had thought she was beautiful before, but now she seemed like a goddess, her eyes holding him fast in a gaze that was almost hypnotic. Looking at her was like slipping into a warm bath, and once you got in, you couldn't bring yourself to get back out. The world outside that gaze was too cold, too empty. So he allowed himself to be transfixed. He watched as she crossed the room so gracefully it was almost like she was floating. Standing face to face with Roger, Adea caressed the side of his face, wiping away a stream of his tears. Leaning close, she whispered into his ear, "This may sting," before drawing back, her eyes now a glossy white and her mouth lined with rows of needle-like teeth. Roger wasn't alarmed, and without knowing why, he leaned his head to the side, exposing the pale white flesh of his neck to her. That mouthful of daggers closed down over Roger's throat. She drank deep from it, but not so deep as to kill him, only enough to satisfy. Roger fell to the floor, his own eyes glossing over into a grayish white. Adea's smile widened as she licked blood from her red-stained lips. Strong in numbers, she said quietly, watching Roger's body convulse violently at her feet. Silas's mouth curled into a smile, exposing his own set of razor teeth. Flies crawled over the raw meat on the plate in front of him. In the back of the room, Francis and his silent buddy slammed their hands down onto the table over and over, jumping up and down in their bar stools with excitement. They had all begun to change. The smell of fresh blood had washed away the veneer of civility of those currently residing in the Red Room, revealing their true faces, ghoulishly distorted and furious. In the corner, the child who was barely civilized already, now the image of a vicious animal ready to pounce. The child kept sifting their eyes back to Silas, knowing not to attack without the master's say-so. Roger flipped onto his back, arched in a position that looked like he was in danger of breaking his own spine. His features pulled back to extremes so seemingly every vein and tendon was exposed through his skin that now felt so uncomfortably tight. He couldn't make a sound but tried to scream all the same. He could smell 1,000 different smells all happening at once. The reek of ancient tombs opening, carrion flesh, graveyard dirt. For a moment he could again smell the putrid stink of the big man George's breath from when he had leaned over him. No hard feelings, he had said, but there were. Roger realized he could smell his own blood, feel it running through his body. He could sense it down to every capillary. Blood was a new language of which he was now fluent. Opening his mouth in another silent scream revealed Roger's newly sprouted set of crooked fangs. As they grew out of his gums, they pushed his old set of teeth out one by one, sending them bouncing and clacking across the floor. The pain was beyond anything he had experienced in his life, but through the pain he could feel a great power flowing into him, filling him up. When Roger was finally able to scream, he found he could barely recognize the sound coming out of his own mouth. It was a mixture of a dying man and the tortured howl of some caged animal. The pain began to subside. Roger felt his body settling into its new physiology and lifted his eyes to Silas, who was staring down at him with an expression equal parts joy and sorrow. Go now. Have your revenge, Silas said quietly. And Roger thought that sounded like a fine idea. A fine idea, indeed.